Hey everyone, I'm Allison Morris. You're watching NBC News Now. Here's what's happening. President Biden heads south to pitch his blue-collar blueprint for America. First stop, a drive-in rally in Georgia. Also in Georgia, 3 men charged with federal hate crimes in Ahmaud Arbery's death. The 24-year-old black man shot and killed while out jogging last year. And over in California, Mario Gonzalez's death in police custody looking all too familiar. His family saying America's seen this before.
The police killed my brother in the same manner that they killed George Floyd.
On Capitol Hill, Congress is both clapping for and clapping back at President Biden's first joint address to Congress, from the history-making women sitting behind him to the president's infrastructure and jobs pitch. Here's NBC News national political reporter Sahil Kapoor.
It was a big night for President Biden, giving his first speech to a joint session of Congress where he outlined a very ambitious and aggressive economic agenda. He talked about his $2.3 trillion infrastructure and jobs plan, emphasized the fact that the vast majority of the jobs would go to non-college educated Americans. He talked about a new $1.8 trillion families plan that would expand the safety net substantially for things like child care. Democrats broadly support President Biden's plan. Let's have a listen to what Speaker Pelosi said, talking not only about the economic agenda, but also the historic first in having 2 women, Vice President Kamala Harris and herself, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, behind the president during that speech.
It was a triumph for women at home, women in the workplace. Equal pay for equal work, paid family and medical leave, affordable child care, universal pre-K. I love that because it's children learning, parents earning.
And that gives you a sense of the broad flavor of Democratic support for President Biden's plans. On the other hand, you have Republicans who have been very critical of the president for going what they describe as too far left, too liberal for the American public, too radical, in the words of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Why don't we have a listen to what he had to say in reaction to President Biden's speech?
Our president will not secure a lasting legacy through go-it-alone radicalism. He won't get much done that way. It won't be good for the country. And whatever the Democrats do get done through partisan brute force will be fragile. The American people need us to find common ground and to move this country forward. And they would like for us to do it together.
Now, Mitch McConnell's calls for common ground will be tested both by his party and by Democrats. The White House says it is serious about engaging in bipartisan negotiations and will meet with the top 4 congressional leaders from both parties on May 12th. The question is where the 2 sides can come together. Can they agree on a price tag somewhere between Biden's proposal and what the Republicans have proposed? Can they get to 60 votes in the Senate? And what will the ultimate package look like? Democrats have the option to bypass the filibuster in the Senate for most economic proposals, issues related to taxing and spending, which is what is at stake here, and go it alone with a 50-vote threshold in the chamber. But many Democrats say they want to give bipartisanship a chance. They want to negotiate and see where it takes them. We'll be following very closely to find out whether lawmakers can come to a deal on infrastructure and potentially more.
Florida went to Donald Trump in November, so how do voters there feel about President Biden 100 days in? NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber is asking that question in Coral Gables.
Hey, Allison, a lot of the people we initially stopped and tried to talk to about the president's address to Congress simply hadn't seen it. They weren't boycotting it or anything like that. They just said they had other things to do. They were working or they went to bed early. On their list of things to do, watching this address at the time it took place wasn't in sort of their top priorities of the evening. But a lot of them said that they planned to go back and watch bits of it later and catch up. The people who did watch it or had already seen replays in the morning, they felt like overall the speech was pretty good. Regardless of the policy and the substance, they felt like this speech was well delivered and that it covered a lot of topics and focused on all Americans, not necessarily just one group or just one political party. But at the end of the day, almost everyone we spoke to also said actions always speak louder than words.
Well, I did watch it. I think one of the most impressive things about it was that there were 2 women standing behind him for the first time in history, which I thought was pretty cool. I think it's good that politicians start thinking big, rather than, doing things piecemeal and and, having broad visions about, what we should do with America. And I thought that came through pretty well. I don't know how much bipartisanship, we're going to get. I think he talked about that, but saying it and doing it are two different things.
Every president, when they get up there in the State of the Union, they always say something really nice that most Americans can agree with. And then you have what actually takes place in Washington, D.C. and across America. We'll see if what they do is consistent with what he says. Time will tell.
The people that we spoke to, we didn't ask them specifically who they voted for or how they identified politically. But one thing that we have heard in the days leading up to this speech and speaking with people who we do know how they voted in the past is that for a lot of conservatives, an issue with the Biden speech and an issue with his policies and proposals right now really has a lot to do with his economic plan and that $4 trillion price tag. We've heard a lot from people who actually voted for Joe Biden in the last election, but identify as conservatives. They simply weren't conservatives that supported Donald Trump. They say an issue, a particular point of concern for them as it relates to that economic plan is the nearly doubling of capital gains tax on people who make more than $1 million. Allison.
President Biden gearing up for a car rally tonight in Georgia where he will be selling his American family plan. Let's bring in NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander. He is in Duluth, Georgia for that rally. Georgia is the first stop in the Getting America Back on Track tour, Peter. So what are you expecting from that kickoff event there tonight?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And obviously, Allison, Georgia is a significant place to make the case for this large expansion of government programs by this president. Georgia being the state with those two narrow wins for Democrats in the Senate runoffs that gave them control of the Senate, basically putting this ambitious agenda within reach. So the president's coming here to say that he's delivered on his promises. He'll talk about the shots in American arms, the money in Americans' pockets, but also what he is trying to do going forward. And that's where the real challenge will be for this president. Among other things, his desire, obviously, is to expand infrastructure and the family's plan that deals with child care and paid family leave, free community college and universal pre-K, all of that costing close to $2 trillion. And even some Democrats like Joe Manchin, who will be crucial, the president would need his support, are balking at those early numbers, saying that they're very uncomfortable with this. I think tonight you'll hear the president on this stage behind us here with the big crowd try to ramp up the energy in the Democratic base, but he may need the support of some others as well as he makes stops in Pennsylvania and Virginia over the next several days. Republicans already insisting much of this is a non-starter. The question is, do the Democrats try to do it alone, or does he try to bring in members of the opposite party? Jen Psaki, the press secretary for the president, saying there are a lot of ways to get this done. So clearly they're open to negotiations.
Peter, 5 cabinet members are in charge of helping the president sell this plan. Who are they and how are they going to do it?
Yeah, well, this is what they're describing as the family's cabinet. Specifically, they include Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary. Javier Becerra will be a part of this. He is the head of Health and Human Services. Some of the other key names may not be as familiar to a lot of people watching. Cecilia Rouse, she is with the Council of Economic Advisors. Beyond that, Tom Vilsack, the Agriculture Secretary, as well as the Education Secretary, Miguel Cardona. Their desire is to be sort of the frontline workers for the president on this messaging effort, speaking to states and to local officials about it, doing media around the country. They recognize that this is not going to happen overnight. Last night, the president laid out this, as we said, ambitious agenda. In conversations I've had with White House officials, they've said that it is their desire to try to get, at least initially, the infrastructure plan done by August recess, so several more months from now. And now you tack on the family's plan as well. They have many months ahead of them. The first priority for the president, as he noted last night, with a real deadline, is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. On that, he said he'd like to see real progress on a bipartisan level completed in the next month by May 25th. That is the anniversary of George Floyd's death.
Peter, the White House confirmed today that the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan has started. What details do you have?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We heard from one of the principal deputy press secretaries, Karine Jean-Pierre, today telling reporters on Air Force One as the president was making his way to Atlanta that drawdown of U.S. troops has begun from Afghanistan. Of course, this is America's longest war. The president saying that Americans would be out of Afghanistan before 9/11, obviously a key marker. That would mark 20 years since the terror attacks on the United States. And the new details that we have from today is that not just the drawdown's underway, but that there will be additional resources deployed that direction to Afghanistan to help with the safe withdrawal of troops and other equipment in that region. But most notably that it's already happening right now. So not long after the president made that announcement, the real early stages of it are already taking place. Allison.
All right, Peter Alexander in Georgia for us. Thank you so much. 3 white men indicted on federal hate crime and attempted kidnapping charges in the death of Ahmaud Arbery, the 25-year-old black man shot and killed while running in Georgia last year. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams has the latest.
The 3 men already face state murder charges in the death of Ahmaud Arbery. He was shot to death while he was jogging in Brunswick, Georgia. Now the same 3 face federal civil rights, attempted kidnapping, and firearms charges. A grand jury indictment says they singled Arbery out because of his race and color and attacked him while he was enjoying the federally protected right of using a public street. The government, by the way, calls these hate crime charges, though technically the men are not charged with violating the separate federal hate crime law. But the Justice Department is using that term because the indictment says they attacked him because of his race. So now the question is, will the 3 go to trial first on the state charges or in federal court in the federal case? Justice Department officials say that hasn't been decided yet. In similar cases in the past, the federal government defers to the local prosecutors and allows them to go first. The federal case then becomes a backstop in case that the state prosecution goes off the rails. This one may be different, though, because of the way this case has been handled in Georgia. At first, local authorities decided there were no grounds to arrest anyone, concluding the men were trying to perform a citizen's arrest of a burglary suspect and only used deadly force in self-defense. But after a video of the events became public, which sparked widespread protest, the murder charges were filed. But several prosecutors have come and gone in the state case, and a trial date still hasn't been set. So it's possible the federal case might go to trial first. The 3 men are due for their initial appearance in federal court on May 11th.
It is time to check in with NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce. She's got the very latest headlines for us from NBCnews.com. Simone, what have you got?
Hey, Allison, let's start with U.S.-Iran relations. The Biden administration is thinking about rolling back some Trump-era sanctions on Iran, specifically ones that aren't in line with the nuclear deal. It's all part of the ongoing indirect talks happening in Vienna, where Iran isn't budging on sanctions relief. Well, the U.S. gross domestic product hit 6.4% for the first quarter, according to the Commerce Department. Now, that's the best it's been since 2003. We can chalk up this economic recovery to the pace of vaccinations, better weather, and stimulus checks. Well, a group of Canadian diplomats is accusing their government of not being honest regarding recent, quote, Havana syndrome cases. In a letter, the diplomats say 3 new cases of the brain injury were identified in the last 2 years. Publicly, Canada says the last confirmed case happened in 2018. The diplomats insist they're not, quote, being fully apprised to the risks which they are exposed when they get sent to Cuba. Well, the U.S. postal system is going to consolidate 18 major mail sorting facilities. It could reroute mail in some places by as much as 100 miles. Postal workers and rural communities are concerned this will only make delays worse. The USPS said it's looking to repurpose the centers and that consolidations will lead to more efficiency. And Virginia will be the first southern state with an LGBTQ advisory board. Democrat Governor Ralph Northam signed legislation creating a 26-person group that will advise him on, quote, links between the Commonwealth and the LGBTQ plus community in Virginia. He says the board will remain in place even after his term. Allison, that'll do it for me. I'll send it back your way.
All right, Simone, thank you so much. We're learning more about the federal raid on Rudy Giuliani's apartment and his office yesterday. NBC News correspondent Julia Ainsley joining me now. Julia, in a statement, Giuliani's lawyer saying the search warrant for that raid involved Giuliani's alleged failure to register as a foreign agent. Could you explain that one to us? What else do you know here?
Well, right. I mean, really, that violation, a FARA violation, not registering as a foreign agent, is something that we saw repeatedly and learned a lot about during the Trump administration. In this case, the question they're asking, which is at the heart of this probe, is whether or not Giuliani should have registered as a foreign agent in his work that he did in Ukraine. Did he carry out work on behalf of Ukrainians who are oligarchs tied to Russia? And in that same vein, did he actually get propaganda, Russian intel, Russian propaganda that he then fed to Trump as part of the last presidential campaign? That's what investigators want to know. And that's why they seize these electronic devices to go through his communications. And they seized them both from his office and from his home early yesterday morning.
Victoria Tensing, another Trump associate and a former DOJ official, also raided in connection with this investigation. What do you know about that?
Well, she's another attorney who's linked to Giuliani, and it was very similar. Her home was raided, we think, around the same time. It's a Washington area home, and they also seized her electronic communications. Someone at her law firm said, look, if they had just asked, we would have handed these things over. She's someone who's very outspoken. She recently was tweeting about how the Washington Post has been hitting on conservatives, and they're clearly just a party of the Democrats now. I mean, she's someone who's a very outspoken conservative who has ties to Giuliani and may also be involved in what could have been part of this plot. And so they're seizing those communications as well.
Julia, what do you know so far about the case federal prosecutors are trying to build against Giuliani? We know this dates back a couple of years. We keep getting bits and pieces. You know, we're trying to kind of connect the dots here and follow the crumbs left behind. But certainly you know much more about what's going on here than we do.
Well, I mean, I think the timing is critical. That's actually the piece I find most puzzling, is why this is taking so long. I mean, we saw over a year ago now associates who worked with Ukrainian associates who worked with Giuliani. They were charged. And then we here at NBC reported in December that investigators felt that they had enough information to go to a judge and seek a search warrant to get Giuliani's electronic communications. But only yesterday did we see that actually be carried out in a search. So why of all of this delay? Of course, it could be suggested that they did not act as aggressively under the previous administration, considering that he was the attorney for the then president. But then again, there are questions of why are we looking at May? Why wasn't this carried out early February, right after Biden came into office? So a lot of questions there. But I do think that what we will find out at the end of this is whether or not there was more connection from Trump, from people in his orbit like Giuliani, back to Russia to once again find dirt on a political opponent to help Trump during a presidential campaign, which is the exact same thing we were talking about 4 years ago when it was Hillary Clinton on the other side, Allison.
It's unbelievable how some of these conversations just keep coming up, Julia. Let me ask you one more thing. Yesterday, Giuliani's son called this raid disgusting and a politicization of the Justice Department. What is the White House saying about the Justice Department in this raid today?
Well, and of course, that's very similar to what Giuliani's lawyer, Robert Costello, said. He said it was outrageous and it was hatred that was driving these unethical searches. But the White House did respond to that. We heard from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and here's what she had to say.
The DOJ is independent now. They're going to make their own decisions, take their own actions. That's how the president wants it. That's how the attorney general wants it. And certainly that's how we're behaving.
So as you can see, they want to show a clear delineation. And it seems that the president told our own Craig Melvin today that he did not know about that raid until after it had happened. He found out just like the public did. So they want to show that this is not the Biden administration taking political prisoners from the previous administration, that this was an independent decision of this Justice Department.
All right, Julia Ainsley, you always have so many of the answers, even in situations where we still don't know exactly what's going on, but you filled in a whole lot for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
A California man killed in police custody, his family drawing comparisons to George Floyd. Mario Gonzalez died earlier this month in a park in Northern California, pinned face down by police. We want to warn our viewers, the police body cam video in this case is disturbing. Police say that Gonzalez died after a physical altercation and a scuffle with officers. The sheriff's office waiting on an autopsy to determine his cause of death. In the meantime, Gonzalez says his death is eerily similar to that of George Floyd. NBCNews.com reporter Janelle Griffith joining me now. Janelle, police are offering a different account of what happened to Gonzalez than his family. So let's start with what authorities are saying about the circumstances around Gonzalez's death.
Yes, so police are saying that they were because they had received multiple 911 calls from people who live in the area who had said that there was a man later identified as Mario Gonzalez who appeared to be drunk or disoriented who had been lingering in the area. And when they got there, they said that he couldn't identify himself, he couldn't explain why he was there, and that he appeared to be drunk. And then as police attempted to arrest him, they claim a scuffle had ensued, and that as a result of that, or during that process, he had a medical emergency that ultimately led to his dying.
The family's attorney, Julia Sherwin, is also talking to the public. What is she saying about Gonzalez's death?
So I spoke to her today, and she said that this could not be farther from the George Floyd case. She said that the officers were attentive to Mr. Gonzalez. They attempted life-saving measures. For instance, she said that they administered Narcan to him. I asked her whether they believed that he was on any drugs, and she said that they took life-saving measures, including administering Narcan, and that they also performed chest compressions on him. And most importantly, she said that what separates this from the George Floyd case is that none of the officers in this incident knelt on his neck. She said that there's a rush to judgment by the public, and she said that there was a knee on his shoulder blade, but that none of the officers knelt directly on his neck.
So, Janelle, if I understand correctly, there are three investigations into Gonzalez's death. Could you separate them out for us? Who's looking into what here?
So there's three separate investigations going on. The Alameda County Sheriff's Office is conducting one. The city attorney is also conducting another one. The district attorney, rather, is conducting another one. And then the city has hired a separate attorney who was the former city attorney for the city of San Francisco, who is going to do a separate probe from those two. So there's three separate investigations going on, and they're going to look into, whether police followed their training, whether they violated Mr. Gonzalez's rights, whether they veered from their training, things of that nature.
Have we heard from any of the officers involved here?
So their attorney, they all have the same attorney, and she has been speaking out today. She said, quote, there are a number of distinguishing factors between this and George Floyd, not the least of which was that the officers were very attentive to the issue of positional asphyxiation, which was George Floyd's cause of death, according to the prosecution. She also said, quote, it was absolutely not ever any pressure on his neck at any time. And she said that Alameda police have undergone, quote, extensive ground fighting, grappling, and positional asphyxiation training.
All right, Janelle Griffith, it is a case that has been riveting not just folks in California, but across the nation. A lot of questions. We'll wait and see what that autopsy report determines. Thank you.
Thank you.
An arrest in the brutal assault of an elderly Asian man in New York City. He's now in a coma. Another Asian man stabbed and killed in an unprovoked attack in Washington. These are just a few of the Asian hate crime headlines this week alone. Anti-Asian hate crimes up 169% in the first quarter of this year. That's according to California State University, San Bernardino's Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. NBCNews.com reporter Kimmy Yam joining me now. Kimmy, this Cal State report looks at 15 major cities. Hate crimes up across the board. Where are we seeing the biggest spikes?
Hi, Allison. Yeah, we are seeing quite a few spikes across actually cities with significant Asian American populations. If you look, New York experienced a 223% increase. San Francisco also 140%. Boston and LA both experienced pretty large increases. One thing that a question that I've gotten quite a few times is whether or not, cities that have large Asian American populations and therefore a lot more interactions between communities and with Asian Americans, whether or not those areas have more or less hate crimes. One thing that I discussed with sociologist Van Tran at the City University of New York was that in a lot of these areas with diversity, there are long-term and short-term effects of having many diverse communities. And so while in the long term, it does foster harmonious relations, in the short term, there's actually quite a bit of conflict. And another thing to keep in mind is that when we break down kind of a lot of these tropes and a lot of these erroneous stereotypes, it doesn't automatically happen with diversity. And it doesn't automatically happen unless there is something that he calls meaningful contact. And that basically means that interactions with people from different communities have to be so that the people involved see themselves as equals. And when we are oftentimes interacting with members of the Asian American community, this comes in the form of delivery workers, service workers, nail technicians, many members of the working class, and many of these workers are not perceived as equals, and therefore there isn't kind of this further breaking down of stereotypes and tropes. And so, a lot of these areas where we are seeing this giant kind of surge in hate crimes, it doesn't mean that, or the increased interactions with the Asian American community is not necessarily going to translate into a more peaceful place for Asian Americans.
Kimmy, 20% of Asian Americans blame the rise in attack on former President Trump's China virus rhetoric. That's according to the Pew Research Center. But a sociologist you spoke with said this is a political awakening. Can you explain that?
Right. Political awakening right now, this term is basically referring to what we're seeing across the country as, a lot of activism. There's been rallies and protests and all these different forms of activism, especially on social media, that are occurring, as well as a increased focus from the mainstream media on this issue. One thing that I do want to stress is that in speaking of this political awakening, it's really a catalyzation of activism that's occurred for decades and decades. And it's been kind of a myth that activism in the Asian American community just started with these attacks. In fact, the term Asian America and Asian American came from activism itself in the 60s. From student activists in Berkeley who very intentionally put America in our name to kind of symbolize the fact that we do belong on this soil, and also the fact that, we are united by histories of both racism and imperialism. And so, while activism has been part of, the life and blood of Asian America for quite some time, it has definitely picked up recently because of these attacks, because of much more attention from the media, and also because of, social media and the way in which information is able to spread much more easily because of it.
All right, Kimmy M., it's great reporting. Thank you so much for coming on News Now to talk us through it. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
We are ready for stores to open, for businesses to open, offices, theaters, full strength. We now have the confidence that we can pull all these pieces together and get life back, really, in many ways, to where it was.
The city that never sleeps, reawakening. Mayor Bill de Blasio saying today that New York City will be 100% open on July 1st, thanks to rising vaccinations. Let's bring in Harvard Medical School physician Dr. Aditi Nurkar. Dr. Nurkar, how do you feel about this July 1st timeline for New York City? Is it appropriate or too ambitious?
You know, I'm hopeful that July 1st works. I am cautiously optimistic right now. When we look at all of the boroughs in New York, we have vaccination rates ranging from 25% to 40%. So we do need to do a better job in vaccinating more New Yorkers. But if we are to meet the goal, it would be very symbolic because New York City was the epicenter of the early pandemic, and it would show a sense of resilience for the city. So given that we can vaccinate more New Yorkers, we may be able to meet that goal. I just want to keep in mind that we want to be cautiously optimistic since we have had setbacks in the past.
So let's talk about vaccination rates, not just in New York, but across the country. More than 99 million Americans are fully vaccinated, but our vaccination rates in the U.S. are slowing down. So how do you even begin getting back to normal in places where vaccination rates remain low and they're just not quite budging?
That's a great question, Allison, and it's something that many of us are talking about. We've had a drop in about 12% over the past few weeks in vaccination rates. We have 30% of U.S. adults fully vaccinated and about 45% of U.S. adults with at least one vaccine. That this is the next phase of vaccine rollout called vaccine equity. We have to work hard to remove barriers, economic, geographical, racial, religious. We need to make more vaccine more available to more people and make it as easy as possible for people to obtain the vaccine. That's the next step.
We're getting more real world data on the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. Fully vaccinated seniors are 94% less likely to be hospitalized with COVID-19, according to the CDC. If that isn't incentive to get a vaccine, I don't know what is. What other data are we seeing that you think makes the strongest argument for getting one of these shots? Because we know there are still people who aren't sure if they're going to or maybe are afraid to.
That's a wonderful way to phrase it, Allison. You know, this CDC study is a real world example of vaccine efficacy. We know that there are three goals to the vaccine. The first is to prevent severe illness. The second is to prevent hospitalizations. And the third is to prevent death. This study has shown us that there is a 94% reduction in hospitalizations, especially for a high risk group. And you said it best. If this doesn't convince people that the vaccine is efficacious and helpful, then I'm not sure what else will.
Yeah, if the goal is to stay alive, stay out of the hospital, it certainly sounds like those two shots achieve that. Dr. Nurikar, we talk so much about what's going on here in the U.S. because we are here in the U.S., but we have to talk about India. The country is doing mass cremations after what is being described as a tidal wave of COVID deaths. There are concerns that even the numbers we're hearing are underreported and that it could be even worse. What is the risk globally from the outbreak we're seeing in India right now?
You know, the Indian COVID crisis is a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. It's dwarfed anything we've seen prior, and it hits records for COVID deaths, COVID cases, test positivity rates. You're seeing shortages of oxygen, of hospital beds. You know, this has global implications for first, just containment. We know that the virus does not respect national borders. So the fact that there is this second surge, unlike anything we've seen before in India, will have downstream implications for the world. It also impacts global reopening strategy, different countries figuring out when and how to open and whether this surge in India will impact them. And finally, it could have an impact on vaccine supply chain. You know, data has shown that about 10% of Indians are vaccinated right now. But in spite of the fact that India is one of the largest manufacturers of vaccines worldwide. So this is, of course, going to impact us in one way, shape, or form. And we really do need a coordinated global effort to help India at this time.
Dr. Nurikar, it's always great to have you on. Thank you for all the medical advice and just the reminders for us that what's happening with COVID around the world, we need to pay attention. It's really important to us at home, here at home in the U.S. as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Always a pleasure to be here.
He described himself as a creepy skeleton. Imprisoned Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny in court today, his first time in public since ending his weeks-long hunger strike. Sky News correspondent Diana Magnay was in the courtroom.
We have just left the courtroom where, surprise, surprise, Alexei Navalny lost his appeal to have a fine that he was handed down for supposedly defaming a World War II veteran rejected. But it was very interesting to see Alexei Navalny for the first time since his 3-week hunger strike, and he is very much a diminished figure. His lawyers just said that he had lost 48.5 pounds in the 3 weeks that he stopped eating. And he sat there via video link, beamed into the courtroom, looking extremely thin in the face, wearing some dark glasses, surprisingly, and of course with the shaven head of a convict. There was quite a touching moment when there was a break in the court proceedings, and he said to his wife Yulia, who was there, Yuliashka, which is the affectionate way of saying, Yulia, please stand up so that I can see you. And she went and stood up and took off her mask for him to see her in front of the camera. And he told her a little about his eating regime, that he was on very few calories a day, just 370 yesterday, that he's made a petition to have 60 grams of raw carrots, but that hasn't been approved yet. But it will take a long time, obviously, for him to build up his ability to eat again, as long, he said, as it took his hunger strike. Alexei Navalny, characteristically, though, gave a very fiery final speech. In reference to Putin, he said, "Your king is naked. The crown is dangling around his ears." He also said, "You are turning Russians into slaves, deprived of any prospects," deriding essentially what he sees as the way that Vladimir Putin has driven this country economically into the ground. But he finished off by saying, "Your occupation of power will end soon." This hearing came on the same day as a case to consider his movement, his anti-corruption foundation, extremist, and one of his allies announced that they would be disbanding from here forth all its network of offices across the country because this extremist designation makes it just too difficult for them to continue operating. You can see how the authorities here in Russia are really trying to crush Alexei Navalny and all who work for and support him.
Russia says it's pulled its troops from Ukraine's border, but the tensions there are still high. So how concerning is the situation there for the U.S. and President Biden? And is this just a test from Russia? NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel is in Ukraine with the latest.
One of President Biden's biggest foreign policy challenges is actually happening right here. These are trenches dug by the Ukrainian military, and they serve one purpose: to prevent Russian troops and Russian-backed militias from crossing the border and taking more Ukrainian territory. The United States doesn't want that to happen. The U.S. backs these Ukrainian soldiers, who, by the way, stay in these trenches, deployed here for 8 months or longer. And luckily today is a nice day, but when it rains, this mud all comes down and they are up to their knees in mud. And obviously in the winter, it is freezing cold here. But they are here to prevent a Russian invasion. And Vladimir Putin has been testing the waters, testing President Biden's resolve. And earlier this month, Putin ordered the deployment of tens of thousands of Russian troops and heavy weapons. And it got President Biden's attention, and he warned Putin not to invade. Putin pulled back the forces. But you see this push and pull, this new shifting power dynamic as the world, leaders like Putin and others, are seeing what the Biden administration is willing to do and how far it will go to defend its allies.
The MLB All-Star Game gone. Film productions pulled. Big businesses are responding to Georgia's new voting laws. But these boycotts are having some unintended consequences on small businesses in the state. Here's NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson.
My first response was, this is not real. This cannot be happening.
That was Chef Simone Lett's reaction when she first learned about Georgia's new, more restrictive voting laws.
When voting in person in the state of Georgia, you must have a photo ID. It only makes sense for the same standard to apply to absentee ballots as well.
And makes it a crime to provide food or water to people standing in line at the polls.
Then this happened.
There's growing fallout from Georgia's new law restricting voting rights.
Growing calls to boycott Delta Airlines, Coca-Cola, and Home Depot.
Will Smith and the director Antoine Fuqua is saying that they are now pulling their upcoming film production of Emancipation out of the state.
These bigger catering companies, they can pick up and, oh, y'all leaving? We're going to uproot and leave with you. Someone like myself, I don't have that privilege.
The New York native moved her catering company from Florida to Georgia 3 years ago in hopes of breaking into the movie industry. Now, that's become the bulk of her income.
All of our cookery, the pots, the pans, it's all here. We just bought this house. You know, we've really planted our roots here, so this is where we want to grow. I was a bit nervous. I'm still a little nervous.
Nervous that more companies may follow suit, speaking out against the new laws or leaving the state altogether.
So many small businesses, from the catering companies to the craft companies to videographers, they're all going to be affected. It's going to affect the economy. And I don't understand the mindset of a governor who would allow that.
This isn't the first time big business has pushed back on legislation they view as discriminatory. The NBA delayed bringing the All-Star Game to North Carolina for 2 years until the state partially repealed the bathroom bill, which singled out transgender people and limited local LGBTQ anti-discrimination protections. In 2019, prominent actors pledged not to work in Georgia in response to a controversial abortion law. But the state didn't back down. Instead, a federal judge declared the law unconstitutional.
I think today's professional athletes are acting incredibly responsibly. I would strongly support them doing that.
In recent weeks, President Biden expressed support for Major League Baseball moving the All-Star Game out of Georgia. Meanwhile, prominent Democrats in the state have argued a boycott is not the answer. Lisa Cupid is the highest-ranking Democrat in Cobb County's local government. This Atlanta suburb, once the heart of Newt Gingrich's district, flipped blue in 2016. On one hand, these voting laws could make it harder for Democrats to win the state in the future. But if Democrats support this boycott, it could turn off the very voters they're hoping to win over. So what should the message be from Democratic leadership?
Some are using the legal process to address this, and others are using their bully pulpit as an elected official to share their concerns. For us here in Cobb, what I want to do is educate our voters on the impact that this is going to have on our elections process.
What is your message to voters right now who are asking, what can I do?
Make a plan to vote. Your vote still matters. And so even though the voting process may have changed, I think it's important for voters to understand what changes have occurred and figure out how to respond to it so that they can make sure they can get to the polls and vote.
We are ready.
That's the same message Tim B. Hove is hoping to send. How many days a week do you do this?
5 days a week, 8 hours, and then every other Saturday. Because, you know, these new laws that they put into effect for us here in Georgia, they're trying to suppress our vote.
Hove has been out of work since March of 2020, furloughed and then laid off from her job when the pandemic hit. She says a boycott would only hurt workers.
We get our work from businesses coming to Georgia. The events that come, that's when we work. So, of course, if the events boycott and decide not to come here, we don't get to work. And we're ready to go back to work. We need to work. We understand we need to get out and vote. We need to get those people in power who are going to help the working people, the working class.
I don't see Georgians just laying down, just taking it. They're just not going to just sit here and just, okay, we'll stand in line when it's time to vote and call it a day.
A private school in Miami asking teachers and staff not to get the COVID vaccine. The couple running the school making false claims about the shots, calling them experimental. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber caught up with that couple and some concerned parents.
I have to rethink my son's future with the school.
Greg Tater opened his email Monday and had a note from Layla Sentner, the CEO and co-founder of his son's Miami private school. On official school letterhead, she told parents about the, quote, difficult decision to not employ teachers or staff who get a COVID-19 vaccine, at least to the extent possible.
Her message is not founded on science. Most of the things she brings up are completely debunked. And she's an educator, and she needs to act like one. This policy is awful and needs to be changed or stopped immediately.
The letter falsely claimed people who are vaccinated can somehow pass, quote, something to people just from standing near them. That a woman's reproductive system could be adversely impacted if they're around another person who received one of the COVID vaccines. Similar claims have spread on social media, but it is not true.
There is zero biological link to anything that is injected in the form of a vaccine to any fluids that go outside of your body through your sweat or even from like the effect of touch. It's just not biologically seen.
As word of the school's policy spread, criticism came in from around the country. Even the White House weighed in.
In terms of helping the teachers, they'll have to check with the Department of Education. I'd send you to them as well, of course. Obviously, our objective is continuing to convey that it's important to abide by public health guidelines, that they're in place for a reason.
Layla, can you tell me where you got this information and why you think you know better than the CDC, the doctors, the vice president of, again, the leading U.S. organization for medical professionals in women's healthcare who say this is inaccurate?
This is Layla Sentner and her husband, David.
I can connect you later with a lady who's accumulating these emails. That she's getting direct, that she's getting direct messages, and she's coordinating this with all of the doctors. And I will say, from firsthand experience, we have a teacher here who herself was with a roommate who was fully vaccinated. She's never had a late period in her life. Never, not once. But instead, after being around her roommate, her period was 10 days late and she experienced enormous blood clots. This is her real life experience. And so if you look at the protocol documents, anybody that's experiencing something out of the normal needs to report it so that the vaccine manufacturers can further investigate it. That's all I'm saying.
It's super anecdotal.
We have no idea.
Based off,
we don't know.
On the getting DMs on the internet and your one friend who said her period was delayed by.
It's not DMs on the internet.
When they spoke to NBC News, the pair tried to walk back their new policy, but didn't shy away from their initial claims.
Right now, Layla has been labeled as a conspiracy theorist, loony, dangerous, but if she's right, if she's onto something, we should all kiss the ground that she walks on. You know, all she's asking for is this needs a closer examination. That's all that she's saying.
Let me stop you there, because first of all, it's not all she's asking for. What is at issue here is that you are asking your staffers, your teachers, not to get this and saying, if you do get it, this is not the place for you, i.e. you no longer have a job here.
No one has lost their job at our school for taking the vaccine.
Anyone be told they may not come back.
At this moment, I have asked everybody to pause.
What does that mean?
And that means pause and let's see what happens.
Will they be paid if they've already got the vaccine?
It's a hypothetical question because there's no actual individual or incident that where the policy is actually coming into play.
The couple founded the Sentner Academy in 2019 after buying the building that housed a charter school. Some students who were at the old school stayed. This person's child was one of them.
Our child was at the Metropolitan, which was the name of the school before the Sentners became involved. We knew that they were going to be bought out or taken over. And, we had questions and we were told that, it's going to be kind of a continuation of the philosophy, et cetera. And we were very comfortable there.
But they say things changed in the age of COVID. We agreed not to identify this parent because they say they had to sign some sort of non-disclosure agreement when they decided to unenroll their child.
At the time, they had a reopening plan, follow CDC guidelines. We will, Miami-Dade has a mask mandate, so we'll follow that as long as that's the requirement of the law. We'll do that. So fast forward, we show up to the orientation, and we see people not wearing masks, wearing face shields. We ask some questions, and we're basically told, people with face shields have medical exemptions.
As for the non-disclosure agreement, this parent is not the only one who says they signed something prohibiting them from talking poorly about the school. Greg Tater says he signed something too.
When we asked the Centners about that claim, we did not get a clear answer.
None of our existing parents are signing NDAs, so
have they previously?
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
So a parent who I spoke to too.
A current parent? A current parent? A current or previous?
Both. I've talked to both.
We don't have any current parents that are signing NDAs.
Do previous parents sign NDAs?
No, previous parents haven't signed NDAs. If somebody has left the school.
For non-disparaging agreements? Do you have anything like that?
We have non-disparaging agreements like any business does, absolutely. And they're taken case-by-case basis. There's not a standard protocol for every single parent to sign this document. We do have, that's it.
Okay, so parents are free to,
I think we should end this interview now because we have another meeting lined up and you said 5 minutes. So
we appreciate your time.
We appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.